Order. A call to order today's House of Commons Defence Committee evidence session on the Afghan data breach and resettlement schemes. I am very, very grateful to Sir Ben Wallace, the former Secretary of State for Defence, not just for his service, but also for agreeing to come and give evidence to our inquiry. Thank you very much, Sir Ben. And just wanted to I know this is only a short 45-minute session of questioning around the Afghan data breach and the resettlement schemes. So I just wanted you to set the scene for us. When and how did you find out about the data breach?
Well, it happened, the first briefing was a verbal briefing where something had appeared on Facebook and had alerted the department or officials that there was something afoot, something wrong. And I was given a verbal briefing by officials about the 15th of August in 2021. So they came to me, they said this has happened, gave a quick verbal briefing, and then prepared a submission for the 19th of August with the details of what we knew at that stage. And if you recall that what had happened was an individual had approached or effectively tried to approach I think the department, but also a journalist, with a selection of a leak rather than a full scale, so no one really knew what was out there. And so in that brief few days, 15th, 19th, we were getting our heads around it, wanting to know the scale of it, and trying to also ascertain what is the threat level in Afghanistan to the people there. And I think what people sometimes forget in all this is that up until the Taliban took over, it was possible to always engage with the ministries of Afghanistan to verify people were who they said they were, access to records for what they were. And the two schemes, the one that had started under Philip Hammond, which was the EGS, the ex gratia scheme, and then that formed into the ARAP scheme back in April 21 when it was actually implemented. That was, you were able to verify all the applicants. But post-Taliban taking over, the challenge for the department was, how do you vet these people? And to vet them, you've got to have to find a way to verify who they were and who was applying. And so that was the background of why effectively people from the Ministry of Defence were reaching out into Afghanistan, because they couldn't pick up the phone to the local Taliban ministry anymore. They had to find a way of vetting what had become a challenge of thousands of applicants, of which most of them were bogus or multiple or duplicate.
Right, thank you very much. Right, on to Derek Twigg.
Yeah, I'm not going to ask you one of the most challenging questions I've ever asked you when you've sat there in the past, but I think it's just one that we just need to sort of get a handle on, which is the thinking behind why you went down the path you did. So what alternatives to an injunction did you consider when deciding to respond to this breach?
Well, the three main options were obviously no injunction at all, a denotice from the denotice committee, a time-bound injunction, or obviously the indefinite junction. And it was discussed with me on, the date was on the 21st of August. There was a meeting about that submission that had been given to me on the 9th.
Who was in that meeting?
So who was in the meeting was myself, my private secretaries, the Chief Executive of the department, Nina Cope. I can read out COO, Chief Operating Officer, she was then entitled, the second permanent secretary, and then officials from legal and a number of other officials from both private office, including people dealing with ARAP, media and data handling. Again, that will be in that submission. And in it, I asked about how many people there were that we thought at the time, and the initial figure was 763 ARAP people in, but we recognised that was out of date. I was asked about a specific type of injunction. And I said, and this is the quote, so that by the time we go to court, we need to know the numbers. We are not covering up our mistakes. The priority is to protect the people in Afghanistan and then open it up to the public. We need to say a certain amount that are out of danger. So that was my direction. It's why I did not go for an indefinite injunction. And as I said, clearly we are not going to cover up our mistakes. And that was written by officials in the record of my meeting. I didn't think it was the right thing to do. I didn't think it was necessary. I think and when it came to the discussion about the time binding, I had directed it was only as long as it would take for us to quantify the people.
And what role did the Prime Minister of the day have in your decision?
None at all.
None whatsoever.
None whatsoever.
The Prime Minister's office, number 10, it was
No.
all left to delegate to yourself.
Notoriously felt that the job of a Secretary of State was to run his or her own department, and that the twerps and number 10 can do what they usually do, the spinning around and making things life difficult for ministers, as you know.
Yeah, right.
So I just got on and did my job.
You got on, and then there was no intervention, at any point during that whole decision making.
Well, I can't answer for the Cobra M's that then took place with the Ministry of the Armed Forces, where the wider part of government came to sit round that table and discuss it. But ultimately, this was about the initial decision to put an injunction. There was no...
It was your decision, basically.
My decision, and as I said, we're not going to cover up our mistakes.
Fair enough. Thank you, Arch. Lincoln Job.
Your last remarks remind me of the great bit of advice: the higher headquarters is always an ass. Sometimes you have to know when to stroke the ass's ears. Anyway, it sounds to me like your officials had massively underestimated the gravity of the situation, and as a result, you took a very sort of time-limited, quite a sort of wanting to be open about we're not going to cover up our mistakes, was your quotation. So when you put it in, you clearly had no idea that this was going to be in place for years to come, and that was because your own officials had, basically framed the problem in such a way as to make it sound, 763 people sounds like not very many. So is that the right characterisation, given what happened subsequently?
Well, I think again, the first thing was trying to get to grips with what exactly had happened, and going back to the environment we found ourselves in, which was the other scheme was the Home Office Atlas scheme, which was the much broader sort of asylum seekers up to, I think, 20,000. I think that was the figure, and you'd have to get the details from the Home Office. But what was happening and had happened was there were multiple applications, especially as the time as effectively the government collapsed, where people would apply to every scheme. So you were dealing with a massive hopper. I think we had 30,000 people applying for the ARAP, of which, retrospectively, you can see from the number of people we granted, and it was about 30,000 at the time of the leak. Overall, it was 90,000 people applied for ARAP, approximately, if memory serves me right. I think we took 5,000. So the problem was, buried in those stack of applications were genuinely people who'd helped us and genuinely people who were in danger. And we owed it to them to go through the whole list and to try and vet people, because imagine if we just said, no, don't care, and the people that actually helped us were just abandoned because it was easier to deal with. So we were determined to do that. I think the reality was it became much harder to quantify and to keep tabs of what was going on in Afghanistan when the Taliban took over. We had to use lots of unconventional methods and routes, many of which are very sensitive, in order to pipeline people out of the country. We had to work with the Pakistanis, who were hosting many over in their border, and it was, I'd certainly say it was confusing. And what I would say at the very beginning of this, when op pitting happened and ARAP suddenly sort of exploded and everyone started applying, the Ministry of Defence had to effectively design and make immigration databases from scratch. Now, what I would say is I was determined that ARAP was separate from Atlas. ARAP was for our people who had helped us and saved lives, and ARAP were allowed to work. Now, the Home Office was always very keen to blur the two, and I didn't want to blur the two. We had a duty on behalf of our veterans and our people and everybody else to protect those people, so I kept it. So maybe in retrospect I should have just handed over and let the Home Office run its own immigration system. I think none of us in this room are always ever impressed with the Home Office immigration system under any government, so I think it was rather better just to run it ourselves. But that meant having to design and make a system as we went, and it was and the vectors into it came from everything from veterans, serving personnel, people in the Afghan government, from the Foreign Office, and then the Suella Alliance and people like that who were bringing lists into people. But we had to check them all, and it's that vetting that I think is where this process happened. But it's not true we let in a whole load of people we never checked. It was the process of checking that caused the leak, if you know what I mean, rather than just it's a free-for-all.
I mean, we may come to it later, but on balance, it would seem reasonable to conclude, given the numbers of people who subsequently were allowed in, that vetting and the difficulty that you had of getting ground truth. Is it, in your view, do you think that we probably did let some Taliban in? Because, as you know, for having been there and served there, being in the Taliban, they don't give you like a card, and it's a pretty vague term.
I think, well, for some we had pretty good records. For some, I mean, again, people forget that there were a lot of champions of this. I remember Richard Tice from Reform being, no questions, we've got to get more people in, we have a duty. The Daily Mail ran their campaign very successfully that actually transitioned from the EGS scheme, the ex gratia scheme, into the ARAP because of campaigns like run by the Daily Mail that we owe these people a duty. So I would often get grief for actually rejecting someone who had been an ARAP, but we had intelligence to say that they had been helping the Taliban on the other side. So we did take a precautious position. What I can't talk about is the ARR, when the ARAP morphed after I'd left, and what they did under the pressure of that leak and whether people dropped the bar. I think it would be helpful to all of us to know, because there's a lot of negativity about Afghans in this country being spread, especially by the hard right. I mean, you don't have to look at the Twitter feed of anyone who let them in are traitors and these people are all sex offenders. I would like from the Home Office actually the statistics of Afghans, but also how many were ARAP. Because when I see a few cases in the media, they're not ARAP. And there's a lot of success stories of ARAP triples and people who came here who have gone, who didn't hang around in hotels. They got a job, they worked, and they've been a great success in society. And we should celebrate that. And no one's talking about it. And I think it would be really helpful if we got some statistics from the government about that, so we can make that decision about did we let in some wrong-uns or not. I'm sure in a large-scale evacuation we didn't get everything right, but ultimately we tried to vet, and we did as much as we could, and that's where we got the leak.
Thank you. Mike Martin?
Thanks, Chair. So when you originally applied to the High Court, you asked for an ordinary injunction. That is, you were happy for the existence of the injunction to be made public. Did officials advise you, or did you consider a super injunction, i.e. the injunction itself, the existence of the injunction, was made secret? Did you consider that?
So the injunction was applied for on the day I left. I'm not trying to wriggle out of it, but in that meeting that I had in August on the sort of 19th, the options were discussed, and that's where I said, we're not doing that. We'll the only thing we're going to do is we need to basically hold off it being public till we get to the bottom of the threat these people are under. And as I said, we won't cover up our mistakes. We'll talk about it.
That does sound a little bit like, even though you formally requested a normal injunction, actually, if you're saying we need to keep this private until we've got to the bottom of the problem, that does actually sound like you were asking officials for a super injunction. No?
No. Well, first of all, I'm not a lawyer, so I wouldn't know the difference between a time-bound as in, what actually defines a super injunction as opposed to an injunction.
You
can have an injunction, I think, without reporting the contents. You can say there is an injunction in place, so I can't talk about something.
Yes.
A super injunction, my understanding is you can't even say there's an injunction.
Correct. Yeah.
So I think I would never have been in that space. I mean, I don't. Public bodies are accountable, and the only time that you have a denotice committee, you could, if necessary, you could even ring up the journalist and just say, could you please hold it off? People are at risk. Most journalists don't want to put people at risk.
So is it fair to say, or I'm just trying to get to the bottom of it, because you asked for an ordinary injunction, the contents of this, in what this notice covers is to be kept secret, but the existence of the injunction itself is not to be kept secret. That's what you asked for. But is it fair to say that the judge looked at the reasoning in your submission?
I wasn't, I'd gone by then, so I don't know what went on in the hearing.
I think that's a matter signed off that submission, though.
Yeah, which is just to go to the court for a time-bound injunction. It wasn't to go to the court to whatever. And I can only tell you what I've read in the media, that the judge converted it to a super injunction. Now, I don't know.
Any idea why that might be?
I wish parliamentary committees could ask judges to explain their judgments.
Yes.
It would be very interesting, but I don't think we can. I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, either the officials or papers post my leaving would be able to answer that question, but I don't know.
Thank you. Ian Rim?
Thank you. So Ben, in November 2021, you told the House of Commons, following a series of other serious breaches within the Afghan relocations team, that you had much greater assurance of data handling within the ARAP team. What are your reflections on the information security systems and culture at the MOD, and how, in your view, was the 2022 data breach able to occur despite the direction you had set publicly several months before?
Well, someone didn't do their job. So on the last question, after the data breach that happened, as you say, on, I can give you the date, which was the 20th September 2021, where there were 265 eligible people in a leak, I put in place pretty robust checks that before data was released externally, it had to be checked by 2 people. I think it was by rank, 1-star and 2-star, but it might have just been two supervisors. And that clearly didn't happen in this occasion. And so, someone definitely didn't do their job. What we did over the period was, after the data leak of 20th September, by the 15th of November, when you talk about that time, we'd learnt some lessons and put in actions. We also ensured that we had better people in trying to produce, putting together the database. We constantly were improving the database and the procedures around it. I think it was called the DAR. We started to build a much better and robust database. But of course, if I go back to the other point, eventually somebody was going to have to reach out into a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan to touch and feel and find their way through. And always in classified information is there's one side of the firewall and there's the other. Whenever you have to lean out or get out of that, there's a risk. Because ultimately you're touching the outside world, and very, very secret information is usually kept in a sort of airlocked, entirely isolated database, and both physically and procedurally we always protect it that way. But if you're a frontline individual, if you're a soldier or a diplomat or an intelligence officer around the world, in the end you're going to have to speak to an agent, and that is where there is always. You need to be extra careful. And I think that's why we put in place those type of checks, which didn't happen. Overall, the culture of information, well, I was a security minister before. I think I was the only person in government who had done something called the Classified Documents Handling course. I think, Lincoln, you might have done it. But it was when I was training to be a Northern Ireland intelligence officer, you had to do the Classified Documents Handling course. To this day, I remember nearly all of it, including the type of lock you have for a different type of cupboard. And when I was a security minister, I was pretty horrified by information security across government. We'd established the National Cybersecurity Centre, and I think part of that has been a lesson that I can't say in public hearing what I did in the MOD, but I took a number of significant steps to try and improve data security from my own experiences that I could see were putting us at a very vulnerable position. But I think part of it is how we now train our civil servants. So in the old days, you did a course, and because it was that we had computers, but not in the same way, you were locked in a room for a day, and you had to do this course, and it was all part of a formal module. Now, a lot of civil servants will take modules bit by bit. They'll log in, they'll do their self-training. And the problem with that is it doesn't necessarily give them a priority of what's really important. So they might do their health and safety module alongside their information security module, followed by their, I don't know, what other module. And so I would be constantly finding private offices where people hadn't really done the courses they should have done. So I think overall, our information security is still not as good as it should be. I think how we train our civil service needs to improve. We also need to train our ministers. It's ridiculous that we run highly complex governments nowadays, and the first thing you know about it as a minister, unless you accidentally have done the classified documents handling course, is no one will tell you what to do.
Yeah.
And that needs to improve.
And you mentioned DAR, and as of December 2023, DAR continued to report an high number of personal data incidents. 18 more personal data security incidents have been reported to the Data Protection Officer's team. The Deputy Data Protection Officer also, to the Permanent Secretary, stated that given the size of DAR, the sensitivity of the data they handle, this is concerning. And you obviously, Sir Ben, you answered an urgent question on the 21st of September 21 on a data breach that had taken place the previous day involving 245 ARAP applicants whose email addresses had been placed in the CC field rather than the BC. And subsequently, the Commissioner's Information Commissioner's Office fined the MOD £350,000 for that breach. So given all that, and to the latter part of your answer to that question, do you have any reflections on the culture or working practices specific to the specific team within the MOD that was responsible for the data breach?
Well, I think what I'd reflect on is one of my generals that we work with described op pitting as Dunkirk by WhatsApp, right? And in a very fast-moving, globally connected world, data is accessed incredibly easily and thrown about easily. And trying to maintain information security in that environment is actually a challenge, and will always be a challenge, right? Because how you are gathering your data is going to come from everywhere, right? It's no longer going to come from a very controlled environment sometimes. So you often have to blend very sensitive data nowadays with open data. So you might have secret data, but you've got to blend it with commercially available data, for example, and that can set up challenges. I think what I would say is, look, having taken the decision to run ARAP out of the MOD, there was a risk that obviously building databases as you go was going to lead to either poor procedures or indeed, poor architecture of it. After that first leak, we started to improve that. What I don't know, because I'd left by then, that the November 23 18 incidents I think you talked about, whether those are detected incidents or actually incidents that actually ended up in leaking. You know, if an IT department detects you not following the procedures, that is an incident. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a reportable incident to the Information Commissioner or something. So I don't know of those incidents how many were because the system worked, it picked it up, as opposed to they actually breached out into the area. Look, I think we can always improve. But the Ministry of Defence is a ministry that is always quasi-operational and fast-moving. And, you know, right now with what we see with Mr. Trump and the Greenland, you know, think about our information and how utterly linked and overlapped and entwined we are. Who knows what will happen? But I hope someone is thinking across government about all the scenarios of what happens to data, never mind what happens in the world of politics, but what happens to data in that environment. And it's just so interlinked that it's difficult. But I don't regret that we did what we did as a policy to welcome those people who helped save British lives in Afghanistan. I think there were lots of misjudgments about how quick the government fell in Afghanistan, and that created the Op Pitting, where we had to deploy 16 Air Assault Brigade and the other brave men of the armed forces to get people out. But it was also a very chaotic time. There were thousands of people. And the point about the WhatsApp was, I remember a serving officer, who, I think he was an ops officer or something, in Kabul airport trying to run the operation, and he was being inundated by WhatsApps from fellow officers who'd served in Afghanistan, lobbying for X, Y, and Z to get out. And, you know, that was one of the lessons. And of course, those names are just banded around, right? So they're just on his phone and they're coming in from a WhatsApp. Now, we're all confident about WhatsApp, but, you know, I think that's what happens.
Lincoln Job?
Very short one. Did you ever entertain the idea that the Afghan data breach might have been done deliberately?
No. Not from the individual concerned.
Thank you.
And do you want to discuss anything more about the team that was involved, or would you just put it down to one individual's fault, or would you put it down to more of a cultural issue within that team?
I think when you command a formation or a unit, half the job is the boring bit. It's the admin. It's not the jumping out of aeroplanes or storming the buildings or the driving the warship. You know, it's the day-to-day admin of implementing both policies and checks. And what I would say is the policies were clear after that initial breach, that when you exit that data into there, that they are checked. And I don't think someone did that job of the boring bit, which is just get the data right, just get that work done right.
Obviously, Sir Ben, there's a lot of speculation about the working practices of that particular team, and that some individuals have described that they're a law unto themselves, that they don't actually follow many of the procedures and protocols set out within the Ministry of Defence. Would you agree with that?
There is always a danger with that organisation that they confuse elitism with exceptionalism.
Yeah.
But ultimately, there are things that just have to be done for everybody. It doesn't matter who you are and what part of the armed forces you're in. But I also know that they live in a world of greater risk than most, and they're often unsupported, and they hold the relationships with people that sometimes you and I would not come across, but are the ones who help save our lives. So it's a difficult path they tread. It is very, but when you're dealing with other people's lives, as you say, I think you have to follow the procedures and the processes. I didn't put them in place to be a pain in the neck. I put them in place to protect people's lives. But I think on the other side, I'd give a compliment to Johnny Mercer here. He was tenacious at getting some of the people from one of the Afghan communities to make sure that they were included and came to this country, despite initial assurances there weren't any records or anything else. So, record keeping over a 20-year deployment, and remember that's what people forget, is not always probably the best. How many regimes of information security have we gone through ourselves in those 20 years? But I think ultimately no one is above the process and policy.
Fred Thomas?
Thank you, Chair. Physically, where did the leak take place?
I can't tell you that.
Thanks.
Okay. Emily?
Hi, Ben. We now know that the breach involved risk to life of thousands of Afghans and cost the UK public purse hundreds of millions, if not billions of pounds. So just continuing on the theme from my colleagues, how were you assured during your time in office that the department actually genuinely got it and understood the impact of the breach and had taken reasonable measures to mitigate against it?
Well, I think the next stage after that initial something has happened and getting to the bottom of the whole thing, I think the overall scale of it was after my time, about how much. But I think if I look back on it in retrospect, you're absolutely right to highlight the funding issue, which is ultimately there were some changes to the ARAP scheme that I think were probably too broad. There was a category 4 that started to come in, and indeed what we see with the ARAP scheme and many other schemes is actually the pull-through effect of the wider family is the one that really grows the numbers. So that you bring in the core family and then suddenly it's much bigger than you and I. And I think, I'm not sure we've ever thought across most immigration policy, the impact of pull-through immigration is actually the biggest scale in all of it. So it's very easy to sit around a table saying we've got to help those people that helped the British soldiers, and that guy helped him, or that family helped him, or they gave cover, or they worked for us as agents or whatever. But there's a tail behind that, and it doesn't mean to say we don't look after those people, but I suspect the true cost is never really put in front of anyone until after the fact.
I suppose, I mean, I had lots of constituents who had wider family, and we still don't know if they're alive or not, and that haunts me. Do you think the department actually understand that? I know you left not long after the breach became known, but did you think that there was a culture there that they understood the wider implications of all of that people actually got it?
Well, I
was
think
it just too chaotic?
No, look, unlike Lincoln and James Heappey had both served in Afghanistan, right? The only people who really understand the depth of the community and how the community works will be veterans who've been there, right? Wouldn't be me, and it wouldn't be many of my civil servants, but veterans who've been there will understand how the community works. And I think Lincoln's opening question about the Taliban are not a sort of group of people standing around in uniform. Some of them were at school with each other, and different different parts of the country they were the community to some extent, and in others they were the Haqqani network, people like that were slightly different. But I think those probably voices aren't solicited. Their experience isn't probably asked by the people doing the numbers. I don't think people making the decisions in Luna House, well, they don't call it Luna House anymore in Croydon, but the immigration actually probably ask people who know it in detail. So that's what I'd say. So who is and isn't in danger right now in Afghanistan? Actually, the people who really know that will be people who spend a lot of time there themselves, from our community of both military veterans, serving people, and indeed diplomats, etc. They'll know. And for some areas, it will be perfectly fine. People will be absolutely safe. And in other areas, they might be. But the reality is, we had to sift through these people who'd all applied to every scheme, no matter what. And
that was in desperation, wasn't it? Total desperation.
It was in desperation, but we'd taken a decision in the cabinet or the National Security Council that we didn't want the whole Afghan army coming, right? Because we wanted the Afghan army to stand and defend its nation. We'd spent 20 years training them and equipping them. The people who had a right to come here were the ones who had specifically helped the British forces and had put themselves at risk in doing it. And I think that is not as broad as the many people who applied. And look, I understand people's desire to leave a Taliban takeover would have been fast. But I don't think as many people were or are in danger as they claimed in their applications. And we did do a process of vetting, and I think that we're back to the point of why we did it. If I'm not going to say it. I won't raise it. I was about to say pets and animals, but the first Taliban takeover, the petting zoo was never closed down because it is not against Islam to have a petting zoo. You're not viewed as something bad. So I'm never quite sure why we had to evacuate a petting zoo.
There was a lot of anger about that.
I can tell you there's more anger than that. Yeah. Sadly, there was more anger about pets than there was about humans.
I meant about the pets getting out, there was anger.
Well, you and me both.
Yeah.
Thank you. Fred Thomas.
Thank you. I think, by the way, also Mike Martin did serve in Afghanistan as well.
No, I didn't know you didn't say it. I'm not saying you didn't.
and wrote several books about it, I think. Can I ask you about accountability and responsibility? And on the radio in July, you said that you take full responsibility for the error that happened in the breach, the individual who did that. A little bit earlier in this meeting, you mentioned that you kind of wished parliamentary committees like ours could have judges in front of us so we could ask them what was behind their decisions. I think we probably all accept that this individual, the military individual who made a mistake and the leak happened, didn't mean to. With the injunction and the super injunction, some of those were, and then the extensions of them, were judges' decisions, not ministers. We're obviously trying to hold people to account. Stuff has gone wrong here. Do you have some... do you think judges should take more responsibility in this particular affair, the Afghan data leak, than they have done so far?
Take more responsibility. Look, I think everyone was after the same thing, which was the protection of life, right? People wanted to protect people who were potentially at risk. That's what was behind it. And the decision of having an injunction, a super injunction, an indefinite injunction was a matter for a mixture of the courts and the department. Ultimately, this injunction ran much longer, long after I was gone. In fact, the first I knew it was going to be, well, that it was in place and then it was going to be lifted was when the story broke in July.
Yeah, no, we're...
So the administrative... Yeah, but so I'm not going to second guess judges. I do think, as you say, some people genuinely made mistakes, genuinely were trying to do the right thing. I think judges were trying to do the right thing as well.
No, sorry, I'm not trying to ask you to kind of single out individual judges and criticise their decisions. More, you're in a position where you're returning to Parliament today as a former Secretary of State. You can offer some kind of zoomed out view of how our democracy works. Do you think the courts, just in general, writ large, across your experience, and we're talking about an Afghan data breach here today, should be scrutinised more by the public, however that works, whether it's Parliament or not? Or do you think, based on your time in office, that it's healthy in our democracy that courts are completely separate from Parliament? And kind of
I mean, I think if you look at what happens across the Atlantic, I mean, I fundamentally believe in the separation of powers, the independence of our judiciary. It's what makes us an extraordinarily good country, and we need to make sure we invest in quality judges more than anything. And ministers are held to account by Parliament. I don't think, it is frustrating in government when you get a ruling against you. I think judges hold huge power. There's the public inquiry into the special forces in Afghanistan going on at the moment, and that judge holds huge amounts of responsibility and power in whatever he decides at the end of it in his inquest. So I definitely think it is important that we have a separation. But I think if you want to educate the public, I think the more the public and committees get to see the workings of a department, the better. I don't think there's anything to lose from it. I spoke to the clerk of the committee before saying, have you got the bundle yet, right? There's nothing in here that tells you anything that's really very secret. I don't understand why more and more you can't have copies of submissions or understanding. I understand the sensitivity around legal advice and security.
Yeah, we've found that on our travels as a committee. Nearly all of our kind of counterparts, be it in America, France, Estonia, Finland, Australia, get routinely briefed at least secret. Do you think that should happen with the Defence Committee in the UK?
Yes. I mean, when I was doing when the Ukraine thing was happening, I made sure that nearly every week, Keir Starmer, who was the leader of the opposition then, John Healey, the leader of the SNP, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, they got almost a weekly, highly sensitive briefing. I didn't have anything to lose about it, and I think if you want to bring Parliament with you, you do it. And I think I don't think most ministers deliberately seek to keep information. I think the system is like in a panic about anyone seeing anything about anything, and I think their default position needs to slightly change. I think I think it also helps educate parliamentarians for one day when they're ministers about how it works. I mean, no one trained any of us. I mean, it's a sort of bizarre position to be in, that we will suddenly appoint 100 people to run a country, of which, if you're lucky, 20 of them have been a minister beforehand. So I think that's one of the challenges, but it would definitely help. And, on the committee's business, I think the annual budget cycle paper that the department does is a key paper you should all see. No matter how embarrassing it is to any government, it is where the government makes its decisions to delay spending or cut spending, and they keep it all secret. So you don't know what's been decided this year. You'll find out in the accounts when suddenly the helicopters cost 10 times as much because they've delayed it for 2 years, or you'll find out, But it's a really important document, and it's called the annual budget cycle, and I would be asking for it. And if this wasn't, public accounts should ask for it.
Agreed. Don't worry, we have been pressing on that, Sir Ben. Mike Martin.
Very quickly, a former Deputy Prime Minister of the UK described to me the MOD's approach to information security as Stalinist. Do you agree with that characterisation? We've been discussing it here. And why do you think that is?
What do you mean Stalinist, as in?
Absolutely retentive and close hold and nothing shared whatsoever you've just been describing.
Interesting enough, because I'd been security minister, I'd worked with lots of secret agencies that were arm's length or operationally independent. So they didn't have, there was very little direct power. The Home Office oversees MI5, but it doesn't control its budget. And the police forces, 43 independent police forces are independent, the CPS, etc. In the MOD, everything goes through the chair of the Secretary of State, in theory. Every single thing. It is the last big sort of oil tanker of a department, including the chair you're sitting on. In theory, you bought it, you procured it. You're part of the chain of command through the Defence Council. You are part of the constitutional protection of the public, because it's huge power it wields. I mean, if you said to the army, you're operationally independent, go and stop a riot, you need to assure the public that there is a protection in that. So everything does go through the chair, effectively, of the Secretary of State of the department, and that means that it's a big oil tanker, and it is 250,000 people, uniformed civil servants and everything else, dealing with some highly sensitive information and people's lives, and the nuclear deterrent, etc. But also line-by-line budgets.
Everyone would accept that the nuclear deterrent needs to remain confidential. But actually, there's a huge, as we've discussed, there's a huge amount of other stuff that just doesn't make it even to this committee or to parliamentarians. Or there is a very, I note for Hansard's, Mr. Heappey is nodding his head behind you. Why is it that under successive governments, so it's not about particular politicians or particular political parties, but the department shapes those politicians when they lead the MOD. Why is it that it's so closed when it comes to information security of things that don't need to be kept so secret?
Well, I have I'll say it's a theory. Please don't add the word conspiracy. But
thank you.
For 30, 40 years, and I have said it, and I'm afraid it does get misquoted by the current government. I've said 30, 40 years, both Labour and Conservative governments hollowed out defence, right? I know I'm afraid the current government likes to drop the word both, or Labour, but Labour and Conservative hollowed out defence from the middle of the 90s, right? You could say that. And it's very, very easy to protect the public from the consequences of that if you own the narrative of the threat, because government owns the threat, right? It doesn't own the threat or the pressures on the health service, right? Why do the public want more money spent on health? Well, they read about it every day, they experience it, doctors talk about it, trade unions talk about it, the media talk about it. You don't get to talk about ammo stocks. You don't get to talk about what Russia is planning to do in the next 6 months. You don't get to talk about, because it's all secret. And if it's all secret, there's not going to be a competing public pressure on the exchequer for money. So of course, when you say to the public, what's your hierarchy? They go, well, health and education and defence is often further down, but that's partly because they don't know. When I was security minister, every week I would read the the top X number of plots against this country, the organised crime. If the public knew half of that,
That's fine until you have a security crisis, and then your military is exposed for. And Mr. Heappey again is nodding just for
it's
the
true.
benefit of the.
So I have a theory that,
You
that
have
it
the white
suits
tiger.
number 10s
Yeah.
not
And then
to
you
have a
get shown
competing
up.
pressure on the money,
Yeah.
so they can
Exactly.
take money from defence
Yeah.
to fund other parts of the government.
Yeah.
And I think because it is the one part where the government owns the narrative, it owns the risk, and it's all dressed up in its secrets. And so if that's the culture, the rest of the department's culture matches that.
How do you crack that open?
I think two ways. I think you need to, as a Secretary of State, you need to be a bit belligerent to number 10 and the Treasury. I used to say to some of my civil servants that belligerence is a quality. Sometimes number 10s will volunteer you without funding you. A lot. Right? We're going to do this, we're going to do that. Coalition of the Willing is unfunded.
Yeah.
Right?
And fixes our forces in
So the
UK.
answer for a Secretary of State is to say to the Prime Minister, no, we're not doing it. Right? We don't have the money. Give us the money or we won't do it. I know people say, well, that's not very team playerish, but ultimately I think you need to be a bit robust, but you also need to lead the team as a minister. I served under lots of Secretaries of State and I did every rank in government, and there are some Secretaries of State that don't lead a team at all. They don't talk to their ministers, they don't use them, they don't trust them, and the civil service love that
How can you be a Secretary of State if you're not a leader?
because we don't train anyone to be a leader and we don't train anyone to be in government.
Mr. Heappey's laughing now just for the benefit.
But it's true. Tomorrow morning you could be made the Chancellor.
Like becoming an MP.
I mean, if I get made the
qualifications
Chancellor,
needed.
then that's going to be a real turnaround for the Labour Party. But, I look forward to it. Thank you very much, Mr. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Derek Twigg.
Just a quick one. Were you surprised at the length of time this went on and Parliament did not know about it?
Yes, because as you saw from my notes, my instinct was, look, it's just
I was one said that so you knowing what you know now, you are surprised that Parliament was not involved.
Yeah, I mean, I'm surprised that you weren't informed. I mean, you could have informed the committee in sensitivity. I don't say there's any harm with it. Now, what I don't know is the legal rules. If a court directs an injunction, it affects everyone. You can't have any exceptions. I don't know. But, ultimately, I think it would have been good for everyone. Sometimes man up, right? Just say it. Go to the dispatch box. I remember...
But we were told that the issue was obviously protecting lives. That's why you weren't told.
Well,
which obviously that was the original...
what I don't know is when it migrated away from the initial, because I'd gone by then, but it was dangerous times. It was a few months after Taliban took over. Did it? I don't know what it's like on the ground in Afghanistan now.
Right. Thank you very much. Emily.
Just going back to the exchange you had with my colleague there, Mike Martin. Last week we were trying to get CDS pinned down on articulating the threat so the public are aware of it, so you can make those arguments that you were talking about. That seemed to be what you were trying to say, is that the stuff that needs to be kept secret, but we need to be bolder with the public so that they understand the threat, so then the impetus is there for more spending and for investment. So why didn't you do that when you were in office?
I think I did. I got £24 billion extra by telling the public how dangerous it was and telling the Prime Minister how dangerous it was. One of the very first things I did was I took some intelligence across the street to number 10, put it in front of him, and said, you do realise what this is? And I spent my first large part of my time telling the Prime Minister how dangerous the world was, and therefore he'd have to pony up. And that's the reality of it. And you don't have to do everything in public. You can do some in private. But the first thing you do, you need to educate your colleagues, right? I mean, the first thing you need to do, you know yourself on this committee how important you take defence. You probably spend some of your time telling your colleagues, I'm on the Defence Committee, and do you know what's going on in the North Sea or the Arctic or the Greenland? And you have to educate them as well. So you need to educate the body of government, and you need to usually educate the Treasury.
Right.
Thank you.
Will you could come Chancellor, be much better.
Well, I'm happy to.
And obviously, this data breach, I'm just trying to bring it to a conclusion as well, we move on to the next part of our session. The data breach has actually had a catastrophic impact on human lives, also in terms of the cost impact to government, the British taxpayer as well, and a lot more besides. Now, in your opinion, have the right people been held accountable in the right way for what happened?
Well, within the team that was processing it and doing it, I don't know what happened to them, right? Because first of all, as I said, there's a confidentiality around the different people doing it, so I don't know what happened to them. I think there are some questions to be asked of some of them who are still serving or in post about why it didn't happen or why there was a failure in their responsibility. Talk about ministerial responsibility. Would I have resigned over it? I think if I hadn't done anything after the first data leak, I just said, we hadn't put in place improvements, I think I would have considered it. But I did put in some pretty stringent, robust views and processes. And, within an organisation of 225,000 people, someone chose to not follow it or do it. So I don't think I would have resigned over it, because I think we were trying to do the right thing and the motives of what we were trying to achieve was genuine and correct. But
in September 2021, you answered an urgent question in the House, and that was relating to a data breach. And that's when somebody had put in into a CC field of a weekly contact email. And then in the written statement that was also tabled with the House, and that was in November 2021. So this is all before the data breach, this colossal one that we're talking about in February 2022. And in your own words there, you'd said that significant remedial actions have been taken to prevent such incidents occurring again. But yet again, despite all of that, despite those supposed remedial steps that had been taken, there was still this colossal data breach. So don't you think that there has been a failing in that?
I think there was definitely a failing to follow those remedial steps. That two people had to check before any data was released or shared, and it clearly didn't happen. All those people didn't do their job. I mean, it definitely didn't. The steps that we put in place weren't followed, and that's why it happened. So, were there any other steps we could have put in place? I mean, 3 people checking rather than 2. I mean, we could debate that. Could we have redesigned a database in a different way? I'm sure there were technical different solutions, but I think it was quite robust. And I would ask the department to give you the actual individual steps of what we took at the time. The thing that I remember was, accountability of the chain of command and making sure they checked.
Right, brilliant. Ben Wallace, thank you so much for giving evidence to our inquiry and also for your cooperation prior to this evidence session and your contact with our committee clerk as well.
Thank you for
Thank you very much. Order. We'll have You're good. Right. Order. We come back to our evidence session on the Afghan data breach and resettlement schemes. And it is a pleasure to welcome back to the House James Heappey, the former Minister of State for the Armed Forces. Mr. Heappey, thank you very much for agreeing to give evidence.
Thank you for having me.
And given that this is a short session on this, I'm going to move straight over to the questioning with Derek Twigg.
Right. James, just before Mike Martin comes in and exposes in more detail your role, could you just tell us when and how you found out about the data breach?
Yes, I mean, it's the same answer as Sir Ben gave you. In mid-August, our private offices were informed of the content that was circulating on Facebook, and over the week or so that followed, there were a series of updates that we received as ministers from what had been convened the Gold Group, chaired by the Chief Operating Officer, which kept us abreast of the department, as the department was rushing, frankly, to understand the scale of what was happening and the threat that it posed to life and the departmental interest.
Where did your private officers get the information from?
So I think the initial email, if my memory serves me right, was from a duty clerk, and then obviously it was the DAR, the Afghan Resettlement Directorate.
Are you aware of how the information first came to light? What was you told about how that information?
Well, the information first came to light through the Facebook posts. That's what alerted.
So that's what you were told?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a third party that had alerted the department. Concurrently, there was also a letter or an email that came, I think, to my parliamentary office and also to the parliamentary office of Luke Pollard.
Yes.
What
did you do with that?
Well, I'm not sure that I found out about that until after I'd found out about it through the departmental system.
Channel.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Right. Mike Martin.
Thanks, Mr. Heappey. Fascinated to read your Twitter thread on the 17th of July 25. Just a couple of quotes. Again and again, I said in public what very senior officials and military had briefed me. It's hugely frustrating. It proved to be wrong. And you follow that up to point out that across government there was anger at the MOD at the breach that was palpable and justified. There were some pretty choice words offered in meetings. In general terms, what would you say, and I know I mean this in a non-partisan way, what would you say the view is from the rest of government of the MOD?
Well, I mean, I can offer in quite specific terms. I mean, there was a very long-running tension, frankly, between the Home Office and the MOD particularly, over a perception on the Home Office side that we were the answer to all sorts of immigration challenges that they were facing. The MOD is incredibly good at when adverse weather blows in and sandbanks need to be filled and put out to shore up the banks for a river, troops can make it happen overnight. When COVID required swabbing stations to be established or PPE to be distributed or test centres to be established or Nightingale hospitals, all of that. So there's a perception that the MOD can make things happen really quickly. There's a perception that the MOD is the one part of government that has its own standing resource with which to make the magic happen. And so from, all the way through the 19 to 24 government, there was constant asks on us around all sorts of things. But the immigration stuff was particularly challenging because we were being asked to hand over camps to accommodate irregular migrants. We were being asked for service family accommodation to provide accommodation for those people as well. We were being asked to provide troops to assist on the Western Jetfoil down in Dover, and the Royal Navy even out in the Channel assisting in the pushback of migrant boats on the halfway line. I mean, there was all sorts of asks. And our reluctance to do that stuff, for all sorts of reasons, caused a tension. So there was always that. Beyond that, this breach was the fault of someone within the MOD, and it had the consequence of billions of pounds worth of taxpayers' money spread across a whole host of departments, the MOD, the Home Office, MHCLG, Department for Education, DHSC, all of whom are all of a sudden going to have to respond because the Treasury, in their wonderful way, sit in these cross-government meetings and say costs lie where they fall, which immediately causes an allergic reaction from Secretaries of State in all of those departments when they realise...
Viewed in quite a negative way then.
That are huge. Well,
because you're shunting costs onto other departments.
Well, so that's not necessarily the MOD's fault, but that's the Treasury saying costs lie where they fall. So the tension around the MOD not wanting to help with the wider issue of irregular migration. Stand fast that actually the MOD did a lot, but there were a bunch of things that, given the geopolitics, handing over a huge chunk of the training estate or the transit camps that you'll both be very familiar with, and Lincoln too, so that they could accommodate irregular arrivals in Dover, when you're trying to reform the warfighting capability of the army, and you need those training camps to have the army and the Marines and the Navy out training ready for war, there's a tension. So that was long running. The cost of reacting to Rubific, the data breach, was profound, and of course, therefore, there was anger around government about that. And people were just robustly defending their corners. I said in that tweet that there was nothing wrong with that. That's the realities of government. The only thing that would have made it better is if the Treasury had said, don't worry, we'll underwrite all of the costs centrally. But the Treasury can't do that. They didn't have the money. And as for the first quote that you made, I mean, on the triples, there's lots in what we will discuss this morning, of which to say you're proud of it is not the right thing in the context of what we're discussing. But the department dealt with an incredibly challenging circumstance, stand fast that it ever happened in the first place, I think quite well, in terms of the way it operationalised the response. The bit that the department got tragically wrong was the triples, which was what you're referring to in your first quote. And it is a source of huge personal regret to me that when I go through all of my notes from the time, I challenged again and again and again. Why is Dan Jarvis, Tom Tugendhat, Johnny Mercer? Why is the Select Committee? Why are various journalists telling me that employment records exist? Why are they also certain that this is different to how you describe? But the department again and again and again kept coming back and saying there was no formal employment relationship. And so, in good faith, as a minister, you stand at the dispatch box and you reflect that departmental position. It's a source of huge regret that, frankly, I was told the wrong thing, and that other colleagues with whom I had profound disagreement over this were fundamentally right. And I'm sorry to both them and those who were affected that
Which colleagues would that be that you're sorry to?
Well, specifically, Dan Jarvis, Johnny Mercer, Tom Tugendhat. I think were the three key champions of this in the previous Parliament. And they came to me and other ministers again and again and again saying that the triples did have an employment relationship. The department again and again rejected it. On the eve before a meeting with Dan Jarvis, I had pulled in a selection of 2, 3 and 4-star military and civil servants and said, I need to, and they'd had warning to go away and look at this again. Dan Jarvis says that there are employment records that tomorrow he's going to show me. I think we were in W4 in Westminster Hall, the meeting room that Dan and I met in. How can he say he has those and you be so sure that we don't? And, they sat in my office and said, we think that he's got a record pulled together by a campaign group rather than contemporaneous records. We don't think such records exist. This is what the employment relationship with the triples was. It doesn't meet the criteria for ARAP. And looked me in the eye and stood fast with the line. It's hugely frustrating that months later, after I'd left office, for whatever reason, the position changed. We could have made the decision earlier if that had happened sooner.
Thank you. And just very, very briefly for the record, can you describe your role within setting up the MOD, the directing of the MOD's response to the immediate data breach? Because you were on the Gold Command, right? So could you just say...
No. So I wasn't on the Gold Command.
Okay.
I think hell would freeze over before ministers were allowed to intrude into organisations like that.
Setting the objectives for the Gold Command, though.
I'm not sure I'd even go that far. I mean, we were being given daily SITREP situation reports by the Gold Command. I think it would be fair to say that there was ministerial agency in being able to say what we thought the priorities should be, what we thought were the urgencies, and there are outnotes from meetings in which the Secretary of State and I both make a number of demands of the Gold Command in terms of their workflows. But I think it would be, we were not part of those Gold meetings. They were an officials level meeting.
Who's in charge, though?
The Chief Operating Officer, Nina Cooper.
Thank you very much.
So just to clarify, the Gold Group Strategic Command Group, you weren't involved in it, but
No.
I think we were advised that you were involved very actively in setting the objectives for the group. Would you say that's correct or not?
No, I think I've just covered that in the answer. I think we were receiving sit reps from the Gold Command.
Right.
Gold was not a ministerially chaired meeting. And there's clear evidence in in the notes that we've got from the time showing that we were telling the Gold Group what we believed to be the priorities and expecting them to resolve that. But the Gold Group was chaired by the Chief Operating Officer, and we were provided with sit reps.
And you were receiving updates accordingly as well on that, yeah? Right. I also just want to draw further on the anger across government, which you intimated. How were you made aware of this anger, and how did it affect the outcome for affected Afghans?
So how was I made aware of it? I was sat rather uncomfortably in endless cross-government meetings on the receiving end of it. And it was, it's important to recognise that there wasn't just one thing running. So it wasn't just Rubific or the response to the data breach. There was a very recent court judgment around additional family members, which had brought with it the requirement to accommodate thousands more people in the UK. There was case law around various other ARAP refusals that we had made. There was case law around Category 4, which kept on growing anyway. So again and again and again, the MOD was basically having to go back to other parts of government and say that the numbers, for a whole host of different reasons, some were the consequence of the breach, many were the consequence of court judgments and case law. We were constantly requiring more resource. There was a situation in the summer before we were notified of the breach in summer 2023, where the air bridge for ARAP bringing people from Islamabad to the UK was dependent on our ability to match people to accommodation. So we couldn't bring them out of Islamabad. This was the sort of policy of COBRA and the various small ministerial meetings, small ministerial groups. We couldn't bring people out of Islamabad until we'd matched them to accommodation. So the MOD engaged an agency to find us private rented accommodation so that we could match people to accommodation. The Home Office also had an agency trying to find private rented accommodation. So you had fratricide within government where we were bidding up on each other for private rented accommodation, driving up prices all over the country, which, by the way, meant that local governments who were trying to solve their social housing crises were also in pain, plus those who were trying to rent for themselves. Now, you could argue that the fact that the Afghan air bridge was dependent on our ability to rent private accommodation was ridiculous. But, it was really tense. You've got hundreds of arrivals arriving daily through an irregular route across the channel. Yeah. You've got an entitlement to bring people from Afghanistan who were legally entitled to come to the UK that we couldn't accommodate because we couldn't find accommodation for them. The whole, immigration was and by the way, as the current government is finding out now, immigration was becoming a very, very, very political issue that was driving voter behaviour. And so you ended up in this situation where a very toxic issue that's very, very resource intensive was causing acute pain all across government. We were trying to do the right thing for ARAP. The Home Office was trying to solve the issue of irregular arrivals. The Foreign Office was trying to bring people under ACRS, plus Syrians, plus Hong Kongers, and all the various other people that were entitled under the schemes that they had sorted. It was, and then the courts were helping with decisions on additional family members, Category 4 entitlements, and all sorts besides. It was nuts.
Well, look, I know you were trying to do your job, and as you rightly noted, that immigration was at that time also was a very sensitive issue. And there is also an indication that the Prime Minister at the time was more focused on the housing side, that how could the use of hotels be concluded at the earliest possible opportunity, and that is why there wasn't as much focus on the problems that the MOD was facing. How would you characterise that?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
that's true. And it is hugely frustrating that, if it's helpful, I mean, there are effectively three valves in the Afghan pipeline. There's the valve that is the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan, or Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, principally Afghanistan, Pakistan. And to get people through that valve is a big dollop of cleverness on behalf of those who design and deliver that route, and some very, very, very friendly and helpful behaviour from our colleagues in the government of Pakistan and the Pakistani military. So you've got that valve. That should be the most challenging, and yet actually it flows quite well. The second valve is the movement of people from Islamabad to the UK, which is a combination of the government of Pakistan and the British government. That was challenging on a number of occasions. You know, even in October 2023, when we were sort of 2 months into the post-breach reaction, I was trying to deal with a very frustrating position by the government of Pakistan, where they wanted the full flight manifest for every Voyager flight that we were trying to bring out of Islamabad 30 days in advance. Well, really hard to do that. So I ended up having to ask the Chief of the General Staff, Patrick Sanders, to go to meet the Chief of the Army Staff in Lahore for the Pakistan Army polo match. And Patrick and General Munir were able to sort of chat that through when we managed to get some movement on that requirement. So, but at the same time, the UK was imposing restrictions, the wider UK government, because it was completely toxic to take on more hotels. That'll be familiar to those of you who now occupy the government benches. So you've got this sort of really frustrating regulation on both ends, where, you know, policy in Pakistan was unhelpful. We could try and use, through our brilliant High Commissioner Jane Marriott and through other diplomatic channels, try to ease that, and also cross-governmental tension back here. And then the third valve was getting people out of hotels or transit accommodation into permanent accommodation, which is about agreement between UK central and local government. And that was incredibly challenging too, because all of that was under enormous pressure.
Right. Just because you raised the tension of immigration, which we all know well, was there any sort of, did that influence the length, in your view, the period that the injunction was kept in for? Do you think that became a real concern of government at any point?
No, I honestly don't. I can only speak for...
I'm not saying you.
No, I understand. So I can only speak for the decision that Sir Ben just outlined in his initial decision. And I was also in post at the time when Grant Shapps asked for the renewal of it. And I can assure you that at no point did I see or hear anybody reflect on the politics of immigration in seeking the injunction or seeking to renew it. At all stages, I only ever heard people talk about the intelligence assessment and the risk to life.
Good. Right. I also want to get clarification on another issue. Now, Robert Peston actually wrote in July, and I quote, as on August 23rd, 2023, at the first meeting of the government's emergency COBRA meeting to discuss the security disaster, the then Foreign Office Minister responsible for the Indo-Pacific, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, said to the MOD's representative on the committee, General Sir Gwyn Jenkins, that obviously he would be resigning. Were you actually present in that meeting?
No. The meeting, as far as I can tell from the pack of papers that I've read in preparation for coming to see you, was attended by the Minister for Defence, People and Veterans. I suspect, it was back end of August, I suspect I was elsewhere. I'd been in the office the previous week when notified, but I wasn't I didn't attend that meeting.
It was, just for the record, the name of the minister at the time, so you obviously cannot corroborate.
I think by then it would have been Andrew Morrison.
Andrew Morrison, who was there, okay. Thank you very much for that. I just wanted to get that clarification. Lincoln Job?
Yeah, just going down a level from this sort of institutional frustration and butting of heads between the Home Office and the MOD. Would it be right to say that the Domestic and Economic Affairs Subcommittee of the Cabinet had wanted basically to limit any extension to the numbers eligible for resettlement to the lowest possible number?
Yes. And you've seen, there are I probably was guilty of being overly emotional in some of those meetings, as some people helpfully told people back in July. But any of us that served in Afghanistan and saw the risk that the Terps faced alongside us would have been, I think, similarly emotional about the need to honour that debt. In my own battle group, I think we had 2 or 3 Terps killed in one night, in one particular instance, and yet the following day, the Terps that survived went back out on patrol. Pretty incredible, really, and it really affronted me that people that we had made a commitment to, and who had a legal right to come to the UK, that their arrival was held hostage by the fact that hotels were full of people that had arrived illegally or irregularly across the Dover Straits. And that, I understand why the realities of governing mean that was a tension. There was a reality that there were a huge number of hotel rooms occupied by people who had arrived in the UK legally or irregularly, and that was costing a huge amount of money and was increasingly politically sensitive. But the conflation of irregular arrivals and thus the capacity to accommodate those who had a legal right to come was a bit of an affront to those of us that thought ARAP was a good thing. And by the way, ARAP wasn't just an MOD bit of sort of emotional, moral obligation. ARAP was a collectively agreed cross-government commitment, and it was challenging to see it not be fully supported in the way that you'd hope.
Well, and also it sets the conditions, were we ever to do expeditionary operations in someone else's country in the future. It's not just a short-term thing. Unless you...
Yes, although actually, interesting, and Dan Jarvis comes up a lot, but I remember Dan asked me questions a couple of times in Defence Questions about exactly that. And when we were in sort of, I think, when we were briefly in Sudan during the Khartoum airlift and things, I do think we have to be quite careful that... this was the answer I gave him at the time, and I think it's worth restating. We don't want to get into a transactional thing that whenever the British military arrive anywhere on some sort of expeditionary operation, people come to work for us in expectation of a visa subsequently. I think that just creates a sort of a behemoth. You could make an argument that the circumstances in Afghanistan were exceptional, and the campaign that was run by the Daily Mail and others around the interpreters was very, very widely subscribed to. But I think I don't think that the British military should start making a commitment that everybody who works for us everywhere we go wins the right to come to the UK thereafter.
No, well, ideally we win and they can stay.
Well, that would be good too. So enduring peace and security in their country would be a better outcome, yes.
So I've got a quotation from something you've written, and I just want you to sort of contextualise it because it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. The suggestion that I was driving a new entitlement for those not eligible for ARAP or ACRS but affected by the breach is untrue. Did you say that?
Yeah, so I think if that is from the long tweet thread that I put out in July, there was some sort of anonymously sourced quote saying that part of this sort of emotional, Heappey's overly emotional about the whole Afghan thing, and that I was trying to effectively create a whole new eligibility. That's simply not true. What we were trying to do was to deliver ARAP as quickly as we possibly could, not just in the wake of the breach, but since the fall of Kabul. We were trying to get it done as quickly as we possibly could. And then there were going to be people who were affected by Rubific who potentially were not previously eligible that might be the breach. Rubific was the code word in government, forgive me, for the breach until it became public knowledge. But no, there was no attempt to dramatically increase the number of Afghans. In fact, quite the reverse. There are a number of my former military colleagues who I suspect are still quite cross at me because when they were trying to advocate for the Kandak commander, so an Afghan National Army battalion is called Kandak, when they were trying to advocate for people who had served in the Kandak alongside them during their time in Helmand, I was very robust in saying no. ARAP was never set up to accommodate the Afghan National Army. It was set up to accommodate the Terps and other locally employed civilians who worked alongside the British military in our direct employment. So, I was emotional, I suppose, about delivering on that obligation to those who worked alongside us, but pretty robust, actually, that there wasn't the capacity for ARAP to bring the entire ANA, nor that was any good for Afghanistan either.
But, I mean, in effect, you were driving for a new entitlement, which wasn't, it was not ARAP, not ACRS, it was people who were put in jeopardy by the breach. That is
at that point, no, I wasn't. In all of the DEA and ministerial meetings I went to, all of the discussion was around how to accelerate the arrival of those who were eligible for ARAP but were affected by the breach, on the basis that they were now even more in danger.
Front of the queue.
Yeah. But there was never, as far as I recall, any suggestion that we should be doing anything else. Plenty of other people might have been affected by ACRS, for example. And one of the challenges, Sir Ben mentioned the scale of the ARAP challenge. There were about, I think the hopper peaked about 110,000 applicants. Now, bearing in mind how many people actually worked for the UK military during our time in Afghanistan, probably fewer than 5,000, it was clear that there were a lot of people who were applying out of desperation. In my discussions with other NATO ministers indicated that most people were applying to every country that had been part of ISAF. There was routinely, we were being shown Afghan social media content that showed, facsimiles of commendations that you could print out and insert your name in order to sort of fake that you had been part of, been a locally employed civilian or had been involved somehow in ISAF or Operation Enduring Freedom. So we were monthly in Defence Questions, we were being challenged around the pace of decision making, the fact that the hopper was endlessly growing and the number of positive decisions shrinking. It was an incredibly hard thing to be the minister responsible for. Sometimes all good logic failed. My logic was, rather than working our way through 110,000 applications and thinking about whether each one is right or wrong, surely somewhere there is a list of everybody who worked for us. Let's get those names, run it against the list of 110,000, and we will straight away identify the people who our working records told us work. And that was, but of course it doesn't, because Afghans list their names, even those who aren't trying to game the system will list their names in all sorts of different ways. It was incredibly, incredibly challenging. Concurrently, I was flying around the world trying to buy up every bit of 152mm ammunition I possibly could in order to smuggle it into Ukraine to support the Ukrainians. It was the MOD was trying to support the Ukrainians, reconstitute a UK warfighting capability, and also becoming an immigration department for tens of thousands of people, all concurrently. It was a pretty challenging time.
Thank you very much. Ian Rowe.
Right, thank you. I'd like to talk about the timeline of the government decision-making process within the relocation scheme. So, obviously, August 23, the data breach was discovered, but the first invitation letters under the new scheme were issued in April 24. So, can you give us an insight into why decision-making within the government under the cover of the injunction took as long as it did, and we know that the MOD went back to extend those the super injunction many times. So could you give us a time frame why it took so long, the decision making?
Back into first, were you talking about triples or those affected by the injunction? Those affected by the breach.
Those affected by the breach.
I'm not absolutely sure. I'd left office by April. I think that those who were affected by the breach, we were starting to pull through out of Afghanistan into Pakistan as quickly as we possibly could. One of the challenges was that there was about 2,500 people stuck in Islamabad, to the point that I was making earlier on about the sort of the need to match people to accommodation before we could put them on a plane, in the summer of 2023. So there's about 2,500 people backlog. Some would have been part of the breach, others will have just been there having already been facilitated out of Afghanistan. So we had to clear the decks in Islamabad and then accelerate as best we could the people that we were getting out of Afghanistan, notwithstanding that was blooming hard. I don't know what it is you're referring to in April, because as far as I'm concerned, so the Afghan response route as a sort of formal mechanism didn't exist when I was in office, but we were definitely trying to pull people through sooner than, obviously, from day one.
So while your time in office, the relocation scheme, what was your input into that relocation scheme?
Very, very, very active indeed. And it is, at some point, all of the detail of how we did it will be able to come out, but not now, because it's still running.
And do you think any of the decision-making process within the MOD regarding those relocations could have been done any differently or speeded up? Was there political will there?
No.
What was effective?
The political will was there 100% within the department. To your exact question, we would have. If I could have brought out 5 times as many people every week across lots of different routes into all sorts of neighbouring countries, if we'd had better relationships with Iran, if the Uzbek route had been more viable, if the Tajiks, the Turkmens were always an absolute no. Tariq Ahmed, the minister in the Lords, and I both tried. If we could have brought people out through more routes more easily, we would have done so. If we could have. But there were all sorts of reasons why the flow was what it is, not least that the Taliban are not mugs. The Taliban, if you're bringing out minibus after minibus every single day, the risk of compromising the route is obvious. And we would see it. We would see UK reporting of the route and then be told by those who were doing this that there was a visible additional presence on various Afghan-Pakistan border crossings in the week that followed. It was really hard. The fact that people were then held in Pakistan thereafter, and again, so grateful to the government of Pakistan and the Pakistan military for their forbearance. Bearing in mind, of course, that it wasn't just the UK, it wasn't just me flying to Islamabad trying to ask the Pakistan government for this stuff. The Americans were, the Danes were, the Germans were, everybody who had been in ISAF, who had an Afghan resettlement scheme, was asking the same of the Pakistanis. And Pakistan politics was pretty febrile at the time as well, and Afghan immigration into Pakistan was a pretty hot issue too. So, we owe them a lot. It was hard, but the political will in the department, under both the Secretaries of State that I served for, was that we had a moral obligation and we should do this as quickly as we could.
But the rest of the government have that political
I think the rest of government agreed with the sentiment, agreed with the obligation, but in a way that I definitely don't mean as criticism, because I think it's perfectly reasonable. If you're the Secretary of State for MHCLG and you've got council leaders and council chief executives all over the country telling you that you've got a social housing crisis and the affordability of private rents was crippling, and those rents were being inflated by the MOD and the Home Office competing for private rented accommodation to accommodate asylum seekers or ARAP arrivals. That's not, the Secretary of State for MHCLG and the Housing Minister and the Local Government Minister are behaving quite honourably in reflecting those stresses that local government leaders are reflecting to them. It just causes a tension in cross-governmental meetings between the interests of the MOD and the interests of MHCLG. And the same is true for DHSC, the same is true for DFE. If we bring in, to take the example of Wiltshire, lots and lots and lots of military accommodation in Wiltshire, we would try and bring in hundreds of families into surplus service family accommodation. all in year after school budgets have been set. So we're bringing people with acute needs, English as a second language, people into a place mid-school year with no money. And not surprisingly, the schools minister is like saying, whoa, how's this to be funded? It's not. It would be wrong to characterise this as anybody acting around government in a malign way, trying to thwart ARAP. It's just the realities of what it is to be a minister and what it is to govern.
Thank you. Just a quick supplementary from Lincoln Jock.
Last very short question, hopefully a very short answer. Were we paying Pakistan to accommodate people there for all that time while that bit of the valve worked itself out?
No, I don't think so. No.
Okay, thank you.
No, I mean we relied very much on their good grace and their relationship that they have with the UK. And as I say, I know that there were other countries who were similarly trying to run their programmes who did not get quite the same level of support we did. We should be very grateful to them.
So the benefits of a polo match.
Fred Thomas, please.
Thank you, Chair. You've mentioned your frustration about the departmental line on the triples changing frustratingly shortly after you left office.
Yeah.
You'll have picked up reporting over the past 12 months in the news media around this idea that some triples have not been relocated to the UK through some kind of process that's happened, whether it's in various teams in the MOD. Has that frustrated you as well, that reporting?
I think as a minister, you speak in good faith based on the departmental position and indeed the government position. We were all bound by collective responsibility, stand fast, and they've been vindicated. They were proven right. That Tom Tugendhat and Johnny Mercer were both serving ministers at the time who departed from the collectively accepted agreed position. And,
I'm sorry. I'm asking you very specifically about the recent reporting kind of in the last 12 months. So not the kind of movement position there.
Right.
Around this idea, maybe you haven't seen it, around this idea that some triples have not been brought to the UK.
You mean because they might be witnesses in the inquiry?
That's what some of the BBC reporting is.
Yeah, I find that quite an extraordinary allegation, and my every instinct is that it is not true. My every instinct. Of course, you could find out subsequently that I was misled, but I can't believe that would be the case. I really can't.
Do you think there have been any problems, aside from whether that's the intent or not, to do with relocating triples, even once that kind of move in departmental policy happened? And we've heard, and be careful what I say because some of our evidence sessions were behind closed doors, we've heard of problems with the process for approving triples applications.
So, approving those applications was hard, right? I think for the TERPs, for the interpreters, and for other local employed civilians who had been working directly with the regular force, the employment records were better. And so it was easier to validate their application. But for people who were applying under Category 4 and for the triples, it was quite challenging. And in fact, the circumstances of the breach definitely don't comply with any data policy that the department set or whatever else, but you have to ask yourself, how on earth would they validate those applications in any other way? And so the person responsible, in good faith, was circulating, he thought, small lists of people to a trusted network of interlocutors in Afghanistan and others who had been relocated to the UK.
When you're talking about the individual, you're talking about the main data breach.
Yes. Yeah. And I understand your point, Fred, about it's now, but the situation hasn't changed. Still, in order to validate whether this person who claims to have been a triple actually was, you have to circulate probably those names to a community of people who they worked alongside within the British military, but probably also to some trusted Afghans as well. I can't comment on how the decision-making process is working now, but I can't imagine how it would be any different now to what it was. In terms of the practicalities, I would expect that they have a more robust policy around the data management now, given what's happened. But you're sort of stuck between the imperative to make a good decision and bring these people to the UK versus the challenge in validating that they are who they say they are.
Yeah, no, I don't think anyone is underestimating, as you've explained articulately, the incredible challenge of doing that, and matching up information. I was asking about this idea that's been reported that some decisions to turn down applications have actually not taken any time at all, but were extremely quick and done in a blanket way. You might be able to comment about that.
No, so I've been contacted by journalists about the same thing and asked the department for some stuff. I mean, there was a time when a whole bunch of decisions were taken quite quickly. I don't think that there was, but I think the department has always pushed back against the idea that there was ever a blanket rejection. I was certainly never told that there was just going to be a moment of blanket rejection. I never asked for any such thing, and I would be amazed if that ever happened, not bearing in mind that I think that sort of the tension that existed was never that people within the chain of command were trying to not bring people to the UK. The challenge was that everybody was trying to do their best to bring everybody they possibly could. Those that were entitled under the core ARAP scheme, but under Category 4 and various other people besides. I really don't believe that there was ever a sort of blanket rejection out of expediency.
Thank you much. Emma Liu.
Thanks, Chair. Do you think the right people have been held accountable for the data breach and the consequences of it?
Well, look, you are hearing this morning from two Secretaries of State and the sort of the on-point minister for all of this. All three of us will accept ministerial accountability, obviously, and have apologised. And that is, I apologise twice. I apologise for the fact that the breach happened, and I apologise for the fact that the Triples decision was delayed to the degree that it was. I also said to John Healey when he came in as the shadow Secretary of State, and I was sort of briefing him, which, to the questions earlier on about the injunction, I mean, it's worth reading the original judgment in response to Sir Ben's original application. It was the judge, and he's very clear in the judgment. He decided to strengthen the judgment based on his knowledge of the legal system and his perception of the threat that had been articulated in the witness statements. And one of the things that the judge directed subsequently, I think at the renewal of it, was that key people in Parliament should be aware. So the Speaker and the Lord Speaker, I briefed the Speaker, the Minister for the Lords briefed the Lord Speaker, I briefed John Healey. The offer was made to both John Healey and to Sir Keir Starmer. They made the decision that only John would come. And I said to John at the end of, I think, the first meeting that if this injunction is lifted before the general election, I will need to resign over this. I felt that it needed ministerial accountability in that way. The challenge, Emma, is that whilst that gives some sort of political satisfaction, it doesn't really, the rest of the department carries on as normal.
I think that's what I was kind of driving at. Ministers will apologise for things, and rightly so, and be held to account. But who else was accountable for this? Have they been held to account for what happened here?
I was reflecting on that after speaking to the clerk last week and sort of preparing for this. And I'm somewhat torn, because I think that the then Permanent Secretary and second Permanent Secretary responded very, very well to the challenge, and it was good to have the department being led by people who knew their way around at that point. And once you then get down into levels of sort of 2-star, 1-star and below accountability, I think it becomes quite challenging for ministers and ex-ministers to opine. But it does feel rum to me that you've got two former Secretaries of State and a minister very openly taking responsibility for what happened and apologising. I suspect that if Sir David Williams comes to speak, he will be similarly open and reflective. I think at the Public Accounts Committee, he already has been. should people further down, people with more direct supervisory responsibility for the person responsible, have been fired? Discuss. But then equally there have been plenty of examples in recent years of the civil service reacting to ministerial insistence on things like that, as sort of ministerial intrusion and bullying and interference in civil service affairs.
I suppose I would just say, sorry to interrupt, just I know the chair's conscious of time. I think in any organisation, if you make an error on this scale and are not held to account, you're likely to make it again. I think is the point I'm trying to make, is if the right people haven't been held to account, then it doesn't negate things like this happening in the future. And from what I'm hearing from you is I don't think you think everyone has been held. I don't want to paraphrase you, but it sounds like you're saying not everyone has been held to account.
There's no doubt in my mind that in business, if something like this had happened, there would have been ramifications significantly greater than the ones that have happened. And an awful lot of people did an awful lot of great work to sort of rectify this and to get the ARAP pipeline flowing. And they did an awful lot of great work with all the other very, very, very important and dangerous things the MOD was dealing with at the time. But the fact that, as far as I know, the only people that have really publicly taken any responsibility are the two Secretaries of State, the Minister and the Permanent Secretary. Whilst constitutionally that's probably right, it probably isn't the right response within the organisation itself.
Okay. All right, thank you. Sorry for cutting you off.
No, fair enough.
The chair is very keen to conclude.
Thank you very much. Mr. Heappey, I am very, very grateful to your good self for your invaluable contributions to our inquiry, and also I want to place on record my gratitude to you for your cooperation with our committee clerk. And you wanted just to say something very briefly.
You had an exchange with Sir Ben that Mr. Martin spotted. I was nodding along with intently. When your predecessor committee was doing its report on readiness in the last Parliament, I was increasingly uncomfortable with the amount that we were saying we could not disclose to the committee on the basis that it gave away classified information. And I asked for historical examples of similar reports. I think the clerk maybe was involved at the time. And it is clear that during the Cold War, your predecessor committees 30, 40 years ago were shown things like stockpiles and held fleets, and that the committee then redacted that before publication. And David Williams and I were both very concerned that the dial had moved too much in terms of what was not exposed to the committee. And I would argue that there are two things. One, if the armed forces aren't as ready as they should be, Parliament should know that, because from that comes parliamentary pressure on the Treasury to increase defence budgets. And if the armed forces are as ready as they should be, then there is a deterrent effect in Parliament publishing data and information to that effect so that our adversaries know. And I think that the committee should continue to push on that, because there's plenty of precedent when we last faced a state threat for us using Parliament, A, to drive decision-making around government and raise awareness of the threat, and B, to show Parliament and the public that we were ready to defend the nation.
So who took the decision not to do that then?
Yeah, you're the minister and the public and the private and the senior civil servant in the department. If you guys wanted it to happen, who was holding it back? What stopped it?
Well, I think you recall from the conversations that we brought you in for a private briefing.
That was one of the best briefings we had.
Actually. Well, thank you very much. Yeah. It was a private briefing, but it was hard to get the private briefing, in place, if you recall. So we tried. I mean, we were trying.
Who was stopping it?
It will require sustained ministerial effort, frankly, to just drive it. Against the institution. I mean, there is a sense that within...
How's the institution?
Well,
like a minister and the
Mike, I think a whole bunch of the ministers in the new government are asking themselves the same question. It's hugely frustrating.
For the record, Shapps is now laughing.
It is. the argument that was being advanced was that nowadays, such is the availability of information online, that you can aggregate stuff even when it has been redacted, and from it you can gain intelligence.
What you're saying is that the institution or the deep state, somebody is stopping that transparency and accountability, and Parliament and parliamentarians don't even know.
So it took me as a minister to observe that far too many parliamentary questions and inquiries from this committee were coming across my desk with refusals to provide the information on the basis that it was classified. It took me to say, this is not good enough. We need to reply more helpfully, to commission research into what committees were given during the Cold War when we last faced a state threat, and to insist on a private classified briefing to the committee to assist in their report. And it took an awful lot of effort to be able to do that. Right. And I think that, to build on the conversation you had earlier, you should want to know why.
I'm glad that you placed those views on record, because that is a constant struggle, and that's a battle that we're fighting on a regular basis, myself and our team, to ensure that we have that transparency for the committee, and often we don't have that, and then we can't hold individuals to account. But I am very, very glad that you did place that on record, because as good as those secret and classified briefings are, as and when we get them, the transparency is not fully there.
The answer is that you are trusted to redact, as your predecessor committees did in the Cold War, so you can hear the evidence and then redact in your report, so the Russians gain nothing, but you can satisfy yourselves on behalf of the nation. If it worked in the 70s and 80s, I'm not sure I know why it won't work now.
To stop it from working now. But thank you very much, Mr. Heappey, and I'm going to temporarily suspend the session in order that we can get to the next segment of our inquiry. Thank you very much. Order, order. As soon as you're ready, Grant, you're ready, and then right. Order, order. A call to order again our inquiry into the Afghan data breach and resettlement schemes. It is a pleasure to welcome Sir Grant Shapps, the former Secretary of State for Defence. Thank you very much, Sir Grant, for agreeing to give evidence and appearing before our committee. And without further ado, I'll go straight over to Derek Twigg to start the questions.
Just the first obvious question, when and how did you hear about the breach?
Day after I became Secretary of State.
Nothing before then?
No. I was told that there was a serious matter that I need to know all about and needed to come up to speed on, and so immediately from that point, so I was appointed at the end of August, and it must have been the 1st of September.
Okay. Are you aware of any Afghans arrived in the UK under the secret Afghan resettlement route during your time as Secretary of State? If yes, roughly how many? It's unclear if any of these arrived before the election. The first invitations on that were issued in April 2024.
So I missed the first part of your question.
Sorry, are you aware if any Afghans arrived in the UK under the secret Afghan resettlement route during your time as Secretary of State?
Am I aware of any who did? Well, the numbers show that they did, yes.
Well, so how many?
I don't know the exact numbers.
Okay. So you don't know how many?
Not exact numbers, no. James, who you just heard from, was the on point.
Did they arrive before you left office?
Oh, certainly people were coming to the country. Absolutely, yes. I mean, you know, there was a throttle speed for the number of people that we could get out, for the reasons that you've heard about. I won't repeat them, but you couldn't get more than a limited number of people out in any given period of time because of that throttle speed. The numbers were remained in the low dozens and hundreds over a period of time because you just couldn't pull people out fast.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. Calvin Bailey.
Thank you.
Sorry, just before I come on to yourself, I believe Lincoln Job wants to ask a quick
Yes,
supplementary on this.
I think we can just... it was a very clear answer you gave to Mr. Twiggs' question about when did you find out about it.
Yeah.
But, I mean, you turn up, new job, first day in work, and they say, there's this massive secret that we've been keeping from the country.
Yeah.
And it's enormous, and it's going to cost billions of quid. What's your reaction?
Well, by now, it's, I think, the 6th department that I had become Secretary of State of, so I was used to walking into departments with big problems that, and I'd been in the Home Office briefly, I knew about big problems that were landing on your desk day one. And so my immediate response was, right, I need all the facts here. First of all, when did this even happen? And it turned out it was 2022. Okay, when did we know about this leak? And it turned out that halfway through the previous month, this Facebook post had gone up and then been redacted and removed by Facebook. What is the overall impact of this? Well, the Taliban could be now targeting a list. If they notice it's there, we need to get these people moved pretty bloody quickly. As with every department I went to, find the facts, identify the problems, and then what are the solutions that you need to put in place. And it was exactly that process.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Calvin Bailey.
Thank you. Can you give us an insight into why the decision making within government under the cover of the injunction took so long? Or took as long as it did?
So I think actually the decisions were being made pretty rapidly. The problem was, it goes back to Mr. Twiggs' question, that there was a throttle on the speed at which you could remove people from the country, both because, bluntly, you had to get them out of Afghanistan via illicit routes with fake information. That's how you get them across the border, you're smuggling people out of the country. That's not an easy task, and as Mr. Heappey was just saying, the routes would become known by the Taliban, and then that puts people's lives at risk and so on and so forth. So there was this natural... And then actually you need to get people relocated from Pakistan, which was the route, into the UK, which required that relocation package. So I think that the institution of the state often criticised was actually pretty quick. The frustration was that even if you threw every single possible institution of the state at this problem, you could not move people faster than we were moving them. And believe me, we tried. Could there be somebody else that removed people from the country? Was there another organisation that could achieve that? No and no, so on and so forth. So I don't think the state wasn't acting quickly. I think the state found it had very few options.
Okay, we've just heard from Mr. Heappey that you struggled, or the department struggled, to get adequate responses and information from within your own department. So why should we be as accepting of that response? It took, 3 months for you to agree on the initial cohort of 150 people?
So the situation's not, as ever when you can look back on these things, you get a 20/20 hindsight on them, but if you think about how this came about in the first place, there was that unexpected pull-out of Afghanistan.
Which was a failure of government.
But in particular by
it
the
was a failure of
Biden administration in particular.
No, it was a failure of our government because the Foreign Office failed to be something that I'm intimately involved with because I helped evacuate 14,000 people, which was an initial assessment by the department of 7,500 people. So the department had its figures wrong initially, right?
Well, look, this is now before my time, so I'm observing this, but it seems to me that no one was expecting Biden to pull out of Afghanistan as quickly as he did. And then when he did, no one was... fair enough. I'm not...
That is the job of government.
I'm not here to defend something which wasn't in my period. I'm just commenting on it because I think it's important in context. And then when he did, no one expected the Taliban to take over quite as fast as they did, or perhaps you didn't, others did foresee that. But that is the reality of what happened, and people will remember imprinted on their minds the chaotic scenes of people hanging to undercarriages of aircraft, leaving...
I do, very clearly and very personally. But the point I'm making is that in your analysis you accept
that we made a failure. We failed to preempt. That is government's job to balance risk and make sure that there is things put in place such that those risks can be managed appropriately. That is what the military is. It's an instrument for the state to balance risk. Mr. Heappey was quite clear that you were unable to draw from your department decisions that information that he felt necessary to make decisions. And in response to asking why your department was so slow to respond, I would like to know why Mr. Heappey's premise that the department was failing under your leadership to be able to provide that information in a timely fashion.
Because I think that the detail required under what were, as you described, chaotic circumstances that preceded this were such that no one was ready for a data leak that then caused the necessity to essentially lift a number of people out of the country, which in the end looked like turning into a large number of people out of the country. I am not sure that I entirely agree with Mr. Heappey's interpretation that it was anything other than, in fact I sat here and I just heard him say it, it was very, very difficult to sift through those that were, let's have a go and apply to a scheme that looks like it can give you resettlement in the UK, and were genuine cases, and those who were just filling in essentially a form that had been copied around with blank spaces to fill it in. And I think that is the thing which was causing the problem, just trying to disaggregate the real applications from the others. But Mr. Heappey would have been very close to the detail on that. That wasn't the way it felt to me. But it felt to me that this is just a very complex, messy situation that essentially I came in as Secretary of State and needed to try and resolve.
The thing is, Mr. Shapps, the point I'm trying to make is that the absence of, if there was appropriate political will to reach in and see these things through, these things can happen quickly. And we've heard about the mess and the challenges that the departments faced with each other about where you're going to relocate these people. So my question is about political will and leadership.
No.
If there was the political will, was it at the wrong level? Clearly there's problems inside the department.
This, just to reassure you, Mr. Bailey, this had my absolute attention, as the records, and I think you will have had all of the paperwork show, occupied a great deal of my time and was a constant pressure to resolved. I recognised more than anything else, as you or anyone else would have done if you were sat in the Secretary of State for Defence's chair, that there were people's lives on the line and that we had to make the machine move as fast as humanly possible. Now, it is true that you had all the various different tensions of where you relocate people to. And again, as I just heard Mr. Heappey say, it's perfectly right that a housing minister is concerned about housing and so on and so forth through other ministers. That's a necessary tension, but it was not the heart of the problem. The heart of the problem that I faced every single day was how you increased the throttle speed of getting people out of the country, and that was the real problem.
And I assert that was done in the comfort of your office, in the absence of parliamentary scrutiny and the public pressure under which you would have been feeling had this been out and been exposed to parliamentary scrutiny. There is an amount of pressure there's amount of pressure that would have come about as a result of direct parliamentary scrutiny that would have meant that you would have been able to have placed your hands across on some levers in other government departments through perhaps a COBRA, because this should have been managed through a centralised...
It was being. You're mischaracterising this, I'm afraid. And let me just say, first of all, I wish that we could have better briefed Parliament. We briefed Mr. Twigg and others, but it was a fundamental problem that the need to protect lives, including, as it turns out, British lives, meant that the knowledge of even the fact that there was a list, let alone the people on the list, could have put those lives at risk. Nobody in my seat would have made a different decision, number one. Number two, it is a mischaracterisation to say that we weren't feeling the pressure every single day to solve this. We were feeling the pressure because, apart from anything else, the judges were making it very clear that unless we worked every single day to resolve this, then they wouldn't be able to sustain the injunction. So the pressure was coming in a different way, not the most preferable way, as you say, but for good reason.
That's not a mischaracterisation then, is it? What I'm saying is that you were not under parliamentary scrutiny.
No, but we were under court.
You did not have... They're different things. They cannot be the same, because otherwise our parliament isn't effective. And the point I'm making is, would this... there is a balance between the exposing an amount of information or a problem and using that to coalesce pressure across government, maybe elevating this up under the Prime Minister, because your other government, you didn't know about this, you said this yourself, you were in 6 other departments, all of which you said were failing. You arrived with six big problems. But so you were used to coming into departments with challenges, which is what you said at the beginning.
Which is not the same.
You arrived in a department with where a big problem was presented to you, which meant that you didn't know about it before arriving. So it cannot be the case that there was a cross-government approach to this problem, or knowledge had leaked beyond the purview of the legal protections that you were asking for. So you were doing this in the absence of the pressure that public scrutiny would have been applied to you, and you were doing it therefore without the support that would have given you to reach across other government departments.
First of all, I mentioned as in other departments, and every department has its problem. I didn't say every department was failing. Secondly, it is of course true that I was doing it without the scrutiny of parliamentary pressure, as you say. Obviously that was the case because it wasn't in Parliament. But there was a different type of pressure that unless you have been under, you may not fully appreciate, which was the pressure from the law courts. And in this particular case, they've been very, very strict about what they felt needed to be done, both in terms of briefing and providing opportunities for briefings to both the speakers of the House, the leader of the opposition, who certainly at one point did not take up that briefing, but the shadow Defence Secretary and Foreign Secretaries who did. And so it was not that there was no coverage, but of course you're right to say that there wasn't that scrutiny. However, you're then saying, and therefore somehow you weren't using all of the arms of the state, you weren't pressurising others, there wasn't a coordinating function through COBRA or other kinds of committees that got to the same thing. That is not true. All of those things were there, and the records very clearly show those cross-departmental meetings took place on a very, very regular basis.
Thank you very much. Emily?
Thanks, Chair. Hi. So on the day before the general election, you decided to appeal the High Court's decision to lift the injunction. Can you tell us why that was?
Yes. There was a concern, essentially, that the risk to life, both Afghan and British lives, was on from the moment of the breach being known, was on a sliding scale down. And I accept that over the time, and believe that over the time, that as we got more people out of the country, and as time passed, because other people will have just died through natural causes or moved elsewhere or what have you, then that risk does decrease. And I always thought that it would be a matter of judgment between when the risks to life, both British and Afghan, and the disadvantage of keeping an injunction in place would cross over. And I thought that that time was probably going to be around the autumn of 2024.
Why?
Because of that sliding scale. The further away you get from the moment that the breach is known, and today, the more people you got out of the country. And also because, for 2 other reasons. One, like the rest of the committee, Mr. Bailey and others, I do believe that we should have parliamentary scrutiny. And it troubled me that we weren't able to, matched against the idea that we must save lives. And so at some point you get the crossover where it's been long enough. I would say that... Sorry, I'll stop there.
Sorry, can I just... I'm just trying to get my head around. So obviously that was July, and you're saying you think things would have changed by the autumn.
I thought that was probably the last time to renew it, and it was coming up regularly. And so
on what basis, though? I'm just wondering, what advice were you getting?
Just on
I would say in that short space of time, the situation would have changed.
Well, probably in 2 or 3 months. As I described, there's a sliding scale, and the problem that you're really putting a finger on here was no one could tell you. I mean, believe me, I asked, dozens of times. No one could tell you with any level of certainty whether or not the Taliban had this list. And so part of me was thinking, well, for all we know, the Taliban have this list. They've had it all along, and they've been going around executing people. And so you could lift the injunction, and it wouldn't make the blindest bit of difference because it doesn't give them anything new. But was I certain that that was the case? No, I wasn't certain. And so each time that it was renewed, I had to be more than 50%, I thought, likelihood that they did not have the list and this would risk lives. But over a period of time, they're either more likely to have the list or more people who had moved and what have you. And I felt like we were getting towards the 50-50, but not quite there. By the way, interestingly, my successor decided to keep it in place a whole nother year. So my successor's judgment was we weren't anywhere near that 50-50 point, clearly.
So that'll be how you would reconcile, because I know you told the Today programme in July this year that you don't think it should have carried on as long as it had. But what you're saying is you were making that judgment, which your successor did as well. So I'm just trying to trying to pin you down on.
So my successor carried it on for a whole nother year, so longer than I had it in place for. Or
they could have been doing that presumably on the premise of what you've just said, that they
I
needed
think
to be 50%.
Oh, I see, yeah. I mean, if you take the same sliding scale, he would have been taking his own advice. And I'm afraid, actually, in the end, you could take all the advice you wanted, and the whole thing came down to judgment. You'd read the secret intelligence, and you'd try and make a judgment. How likely is it, and this is the simple calculation, it's really black and white, how likely was it that if the injunction was lifted, that people would die? That was the calculation. And in my judgment, we were getting towards a crossover point where the chances are that the Taliban probably already had this information and that therefore this could be lifted. And I've tried to, through open source, largely, monitor the situation since the injunction's been lifted, now winding forward another year, and I've seen nothing that indicates that there have been an increased number of Taliban attacks on the individuals. So I think that it was probably kept in place for too long. I think it was coming towards its end, but I thought that the autumn was probably going to be about the right time. That was sort of in my mind. My mental model was, in the autumn of that year, 24, we'll probably stop seeking to renew this.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Sir Grant, I just wanted to confirm the fact that there was a complete lack of democratic accountability, of transparency, as has already been pointed out. But why did you initially resist your officials' advice to brief the Shadow Secretary of State for Defence on Privy Council terms?
Yeah, so it was only for a short period of time, but first of all we needed to establish all of the facts, and given that we provided multiple briefings to the Shadow Secretary of State and where he wanted them to the opposition leader, it wasn't a desire, and indeed to the leaders, to the speakers of the houses, it wasn't a desire not to include them, it was merely a desire to establish facts before we started to spread this further.
When you say briefly, you only how long is briefly?
I mean, it will be in the. I can write back to you. It will be in the file there. But it wasn't a particularly long period of time. What I needed to do. Yeah, I think about a month.
About a month.
I think that's probably right.
You decided not to brief the Shadow Secretary.
Because I think in any crisis situation, the first thing to do is not to widen the scope. The first thing is to find the facts and then to start to brief others.
So what made you change your mind on this in due course? Was it just that you thought
we just got to grips with, I mean, so I come into the situation where there's been this leak, we need to do something about it, we're going to put these programs in place, I need to find out the extent of it and fully understand what's behind it. And look, I know that Parliament always wants to know. I was a parliamentarian for 19 years, right? If I was your side of I'd be saying the same thing.
That's why we're so shocked.
And of course the media are keen to know. But the truth is, there are just times, folks, and this is the grown-up world we live in, where the executive power, the cabinet essentially, have to make decisions. I can give you many examples.
In a grown-up world, Sir Grant, with all due respect, while we're shocked that having been a parliamentarian for so long that you decided to significantly curtail the workings of Parliament, of the Defence Committee. And why did you decide to exclude the then chair of the Defence Committee? Did you not trust the chair of the Defence Committee at the time?
It's not about trusting somebody or not trusting somebody. It's just about wanting to save lives. And if you want to save lives, then you will keep the information.
The chair of the Defence Committee at the time would have stopped you from saving lives by briefing them.
So look, where you have a situation where not just the list, but the knowledge that the list exists could itself put people's lives at risk, you have to decide where that line is, where to draw that line. And my view was, first of all, establish the facts, and then we can start to brief people, and we did in the manner in which we've described. There are lots of things that we don't share with parliamentarians. Look, folks, I can say this now because I'm not a parliamentarian, right? The position of the nuclear subs, the codes. You know, there are just things that we cannot share. And I did not feel...
With all due respect, Sir Grant, I don't think that the chair of the Defence Committee or the chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee, who you decided you did not want to brief, that they would have been requesting you for nuclear codes, and likewise, I'm not requesting anybody for any nuclear codes or the like. But at the very least, I think it would have been courteous to extend that briefing to the chair of the Defence Committee and the chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee. But you decided not to do that. And that really has put your record in a bad light, wouldn't you say?
Look, I disagree, and I understand that the committee may disagree with me on this. But unless you sat in a chair where... And the committee will, I think, concede that the more people who know about it, the more people could know about it, because unfortunately things do get around. And the more it was talked of and known of, there was, even if it's a very small chance, 1% greater risk that might get out, then that's a 1% greater risk that people will die, including British forces.
Let's recognise the facts. There were several, and when I do mean several journalists, activists and Afghans that were all aware of the data breach. You know, the thing had been put on Facebook, for God's sake. You know, I'm sure the chair of the Defence Committee and the chair of the Intelligence Security Committee should have been made privy to that information. And in fact, there should have been a briefing given to all Defence Committee members. But you decided against that.
No, I just disagree. I just disagree. And no offence to anybody, and probably the members in this room were not the people on the committee necessarily, and some may have been. I disagree. Where there are people's lives at stake, there are just times where you have to use executive authority in order to protect lives. And I know this is not what people want to hear, and everyone thinks that everything should be shared all the time. As soon as you reach out further, there is a chance that somebody says something to someone and word gets back. And frankly, I'd rather be sat in front of you today explaining why I acted to save lives than sat in front of you today to try and explain why I didn't act and people died.
Yeah, but I think all of us are on the side of saving lives, on making sure that the right thing is done. You took a decision to keep that circle very, very tight.
Yes,
just for yourself and a few of the officials,
including the opposition and the leaders of the speakers of the House.
But with all due respect, the members of the Defence Committee are duly elected by the House. They have the trust and confidence of 650 fellow parliamentarians, and I am sure that those individuals who are regularly the outriders for defence, and I'm sure that's what committee members are doing at the moment, that our predecessor committee, that they should have had access to that, and that is what I think has actually led to this debacle being worse than it is, because those decisions weren't taken, and that's a deficiency in democratic accountability has led to the situation whereby we now all feel that the wrong decision was taken at the time.
I respectfully disagree. You've asked me here to tell you what I think, and what I think is everybody says, you can trust me, tell me on parliamentary terms, tell me on Privy Council terms, or tell me on... Everyone is going to say that. But the truth is, even if that made it 1% more likely that people would die as a result of the knowledge of this list spreading further, I was not prepared to take that risk. As simple as that. And look, there is always a proper balance between executive authority, parliamentary authority, the courts, and you may think I drew the line in the wrong place. I go to sleep at night knowing that I drew the line in the place where I thought most lives would be saved. And that's the decision I decided on.
Well, I think we'll have to agree to disagree there, because we live in a parliamentary democracy. I think that people should be, especially elected members to those respective committees, should be entrusted with that. But let me move on to Lincoln's job.
That would involve, just to probe that a little further, that would involve people who are not actually even privy councillors now having very top secret classified information. And I just think that in the real world, when it comes to saving lives, there are times when the state has to go about its business
in the
through
real
executive
world,
power.
when so many journalists, activists, Afghans, and all and sundry who were on Facebook already knew about it.
Well, look,
so
I'm not the courts, right? I wasn't the courts, and the courts decided on a super injunction. So the courts looked at this and decided it was serious enough that even the fact of there being an injunction couldn't be reported. I did not then want to go around undermining that by spreading the word further.
It's also my understanding that the courts were actually advising at the time that there is a lack of democratic accountability and that perhaps other people should be briefed.
And you know, as we had those discussions, it was a developing situation. It wasn't the same on day one as it was in month 6. But as that situation developed, we indeed did widen the net of those who were briefed. And as I've already discussed, I felt that it was an injunction that could be probably lifted at around the autumn of 2024, and yet my successor actually decided, I'm not criticising, he will have had his own views on this, but to hold it in place for a whole another year. And I don't know whether my successor did or did not brief this committee during that time. I understand.
We will be questioning your successor.
Yeah.
I mean, the lack of time,
for a much longer period of time, somebody else came to the same decision, which is interesting to me.
Yeah, we will be fully inquiring into the RIMA review and everything else, all the actions taken by the current government. But let me move on to Lincoln Job.
Yeah, can I just look at the mechanics of how the compartment of a super injunction gets extended? So, for example, was it your decision to read in, do you apply to the court saying we think the Speaker should be read into this? Or does the judge just come to his own position?
So my understanding of the mechanics, I was never in the room for that, in court, is in a closed hearing, there's a discussion with the legal counsel from the department and the judge to, I guess, come up with a proposal. And the judge will say, well, this will continue, but you need to inform the speakers, or you make sure you're continuing to brief the Shadow Defence Secretary, or perhaps it should be the leader of the opposition.
And so, I mean, I don't know whether the Secretary of State gives instructions to his sort of lead counsel on issues as important as this, but are you aware of the motivation of reading in, suggesting that the Speaker be read in? Was it that that would, in some way at least, Parliament would know, in inverted commas, or was it in order to thwart, say, him giving an urgent question if someone had found out about the data breach and he would say, no, I'm not going to give an urgent question on that. Was that the motivation behind it?
Yes, it was to bring in that degree of parliamentary scrutiny, even though it couldn't be a full scrutiny on the floor of the House, or indeed under the decisions, even the Select Committee. It was to bring in some parliamentary scrutiny to the process, and also to inform the Speaker, perhaps so the Speaker didn't inadvertently actually grant I guess you could have a situation where the Speaker could inadvertently grant a debate without realising there was indeed an injunction in place. So I think
it was more to ensure there would be no further parliamentary scrutiny, not to ensure.
Well, the judge's view, I recall, was that this would be as a substitute for parliamentary scrutiny, that a number of people in Parliament would know about it, including, as I say, the leader of the opposition and the Shadow Defence Secretary.
And and you say that the judge and your lead counsel came up with this plan themselves, that not,
yes,
not under your direction.
I wasn't in the room for these conversations, but but there would be a hearing. And the judge would typically be very interested in what's the progress, that's how many people are coming out, and what's the status of the programme, and how do we make sure that there is some parliamentary knowledge of this, and I guess through that process.
And last one, in your subsequent conversations and your open source sort of research and things like that, and conversations with journalists, have you come across anyone asserting that a super injunction has been served on the Speaker of the House of Commons before? Or was this unique?
I am not aware. I don't think that's quite characterising it correctly, though, because there will have been super injunctions before that would have been of interest to parliamentarians. I don't think I see he was sort of served by being briefed, essentially. Yes, I see your point. Yeah. I don't know the answer to that.
Thank you.
So Grant, we're debating about parliamentary scrutiny and democratic accountability and transparency. But is it not also the case that the super injunction, which was regularly reviewed by the High Court judge, that on the 21st of May 2024, the day before the election, he intimated that it should now be discharged, but you then decided to appeal that decision, even though that's what the court decision was. And we all know that where that has led to the prolongation of that, not just injunction but super injunction. So why did you decide to do that?
Well, so as I said in the previous answer, I felt that on the balance of evidence, and it was difficult to be precise about this because the briefings frankly led to different conclusions depending on who you asked, but on the balance of evidence, we probably needed another 2 or 3 months to get the number of cases out that would make me feel that the balance of saving lives was improved by having a super injunction in place. There was a downside to the court activity that I think is important to put on record for the committee and may not be widely understood, and it's this. The courts, in order to keep the injunction in place, continued to push for higher and higher numbers of Afghans to be relocated to the United Kingdom, to a point that, in my view, was in danger of becoming unacceptable on the other side of this equation. And so, and I should explain this actually, the reason why I thought that there was no more than perhaps 2 or 3 months that we should allow this to stay in place was we were getting to the point where I was worrying that the scheme would end up letting people in that on balance probably were not entitled to come to the United Kingdom. Every time this went back to court, the judges would say, yeah, we'll keep this in place, this injunction in place, but you need to expand the scheme. And this is the other reason why I thought that the scheme was coming to the end of its useful life, along with the further away from the breach, the less chance there was the Taliban were going after these people, or they already knew about it, and therefore you could lift it. So I thought there was one more turn of the wheel, and I thought that, as I said, that summer or autumn, we would cease to resist it. I'm actually fascinated that my successor then actually did keep it in place for a whole another year, and whether that was on the basis of more intelligence or some other reason, but that's where I was headed with it.
Thanks, Chair. Just to revisit that, so you said one more turn of the wheel, and you'd said in answer to my earlier question that you thought maybe it's around the autumn time. So why then did you apply for an indefinite extension in the May instead of just a temporary extension?
Yeah, I think probably just a legal kind of nicety, as it were. It wasn't that we were trying to keep it in place forever. It's just probably just stop having to go back every 2 or 3 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever it was to renew it. But it wasn't a sort of it wasn't for any other reason.
How it's confusing to us though. Look, you know, you're saying you think autumn it should have probably been lifted. You were constantly reviewing it, but yet you applied for an indefinite extension.
And the reason you can know, it's hard to sort of get into somebody's head after the point and say what were they thinking at the time. But it's the reason I mentioned the other factor on this was I was starting to become concerned that the courts were becoming very gung-ho about the size of the overall scheme, and every time they were renewing it, including more families, more extensions of the families, more, and so there was, if you like, there was a real pressure that I was feeling to bring it to a close. So it wasn't that I wanted it to be in place forever, because I didn't want it to turn into a scheme that was then trying to do something that the original plan to save people who genuinely helped this country when we asked them to, and to get them out, but it wasn't to bring out
Was there not an
everyone else.
option to apply for just a temporary extension?
I don't know. I suspect that was just however the lawyers happened to frame it at the time. I think it may have just been that they decided that rather than going back every 3 weeks, they would ask for something that was longer. But I wasn't, as far as I'm aware, I wasn't privy to specifically what language the lawyers used in the extension itself, as far as I recall.
Thank you. Ian?
Thank you.
Sorry, I should just say for completeness to the committee, I don't recall that one way or the other, and I'm very happy to write back to the committee with what actually was the decision tree at that moment in time. But as far as I say, there was a very, very good reason why I didn't want this to carry on forever, as explained, and so it wouldn't have been in my interest for it to continue as a permanent, and nor would the courts ever provide. I don't think the courts would ever provide a permanent.
I think you get the point I'm making. You applied for an indefinite.
I do, but I think it was probably illegal.
Based on your thought that you didn't want an indefinite extension.
Yeah, I think it's probably just the way that the lawyers sort of went off.
Your offer of a written
Right.
clarification would be greatly
Yeah,
appreciated.
sure.
So thank you very
I'll
much.
be interested to see.
Lincoln Job, just briefly, please.
Yeah, I'm intrigued by this ever-increasing demand signal being set by the judges. We've heard from others this morning that politically this is now starting to give you a problem because of the pressure on, the juxtaposition of people who come here illegally being in accommodation, the way in which that's driving up rent prices and driving out local authorities from doing their own social care and things like that. So we can see that problem's getting bigger and bigger. And you've just said that it was getting further and further away from the original intent. So on what basis do you think that the judge is extending that? Because presumably he's only getting his briefings from the MOD.
So the judge was actually, to the chair's point, the judge was concerned, as we all were. I don't want my robustness about how I thought about keeping this super injunction secret to save lives. I don't want that to be confused with thinking that I don't believe in democracy. I do. And I think, the judge shared the same view that if this was going to be kept under an injunction, that the quid pro quo was you had a increasing circle of parliamentarians through different bits of the parliamentary machine that would need to know, and also that the judges seem to be becoming quite activist in terms of the list. Now, I didn't agree with the judge's interpretation, but the deal increasingly, every time this went back to court, seemed to be, you can keep this in place, but you need to let more and more people in. And we were getting further and further away from the original point of the scheme. And so you might ask the question, well, why then renew it? And the simple answer for me was I still wasn't at any given moment confident enough that we saved the lives of the right people who'd actually helped us, including Brits, as is now known, but wasn't known initially when the super injunction was lifted, but also British Special Forces.
But I don't think that answers my question, which is, on what basis is the judge extending the remit if they're only getting their information from the MOD? Because the MOD is the source of knowledge for the threat to life.
Yeah. So they were also, as I understand it, getting their information from Secret Services briefings, essentially.
Okay.
So it wasn't. I think I'm right in saying it wasn't necessarily directly through the MOD. It was also through the intelligence service briefings.
Because you characterised the judge's decision making as getting increasingly activist.
Yes.
And you've also said, but they're also getting secret information from elsewhere.
Yes, I mean not sort of illicitly, but we would organise for them to have intelligence briefings, and they'd have the intelligence briefings, and then they'd come back and go, well, what about this group here, who are the family members of this person over here? And suddenly the numbers were going from the low hundreds into the many thousands, even tens of thousands, even 100,000 plus, and it was becoming unacceptable. And actually, again, to the committee's point, I was reaching the point of thinking, well, the crossover occurs when you you know, when you think you've got enough people, or the number of people you're going to get safe, you've got safe, and now you're getting into a whole new cohorts of people who, you know, possibly don't have any particular reason to be here, but the judge is forcing us in that direction, which is the other reason why I knew it needed to come to an end.
Well, we can examine that with the Secretary of State next week.
Yeah, no doubt. We'll look forward to it. Ian Room.
Yeah, thank you. Given the exceptional circumstances of this super injunction, just for the record, did you ever meet with your successor, John Ely, to discuss this, to do an handover, or was it left to the departments?
Specifically, the minister responsible, which was James Heappey, who you've heard from, handled those briefings directly. I did call the minister after the election, the new Secretary of State, after the election, to provide a handover, but obviously there's not matters that we could discuss widely over the phone. But my attitude was with the current Defence Secretary and then opposition Defence Secretary, the Shadow Defence Secretary, was to entrust him with briefings. He, you know, is in the role that I think, in the best interests of this country, required him to come into, to win the election, which certainly looked likely, required him to come into the job with as much practical information as possible. And I've always had an extremely good relationship with the current Defence Secretary, because I think matters of national security matter more than politics.
Yeah. So we all learn through our experiences in life. So my final question is, with hindsight, what, if anything, would you have done differently during your time as Secretary of State?
Well, possibly in other areas, a number of things, but in this particular area, and I know that the easy answer would be to satisfy the committee and say, well, maybe I would have briefed everyone earlier. I wouldn't have done. If I lived my time again, and on this particular issue, I am satisfied that my course of action is more likely to have saved more lives of Afghans, but also of Brits, than any other course of action. I wouldn't have altered it.
Thank you very much, Sir Grant. That brings to a conclusion our evidence session today. Very, very grateful to you for your contribution to our inquiry and for giving evidence to the committee. With that, I bring the session to an end. Order, order.
Thank you.